welcome to this month's video on all things art journaling and drawing. And as ever, thank you so much for your subscription. I really appreciate it and I hope that you're enjoying these videos. So this month I'm going to be responding to a request, which I'm really happy to do. So please send me any requests of things you might like me to have a look at and explore, whether that's materials or techniques or whatever it might be. Let me know and I will be able to do a video on it. So this month we are going to be thinking about using watercolour pencils, and I've got a couple of sets that I will show you, plus a couple of sets also of watercolour pastels, kind of watercolour oil pastels, which seems a bit of a contradiction, but they do work. So what I think I'm going to do is literally just do an introduction for this month to kind of demonstrate some ways of using them and then having a play with them. And then next month in October, I will follow up with using them to make a drawing or a few drawings with them. So I was thinking maybe in the meantime, if you haven't got some already, you might want to invest in a set, but there's absolutely no pressure to do that whatsoever. But for now, for this month, let's just have a look at them, get to know them a little bit and see what they can do, and then next month we'll employ them properly. Okay, so I hope you enjoy, and thank you very much. Let's get going. So let's begin by having a look at some watercolour pencils. I've got two sets, although I'm sure that there are plenty more available. So one set, well, they're both quite old. This is my Derwent watercolour set. So I'm afraid I can't remember how much these were because I've had them for so long. So I've got a Derwent watercolour set, and then I've also got a set from WH Smith, which I think were cheaper, but they were probably still, you know, a fairly decent price, but they would have been cheaper. And I do know that there's a slight difference in kind of quality, in that I think that the Derwent have got more pigment. So I'm just trying that dry for now. Let's try a kind of comparable blue. I mean, I think maybe the Derwent feels a little bit softer. So I'm using my pencils on some watercolour paper at the moment. And for this demonstration, what I'm going to do is use the watercolour paper and also use some paper from my mixed media pad. I've also got a set of watercolour paintbrushes with me. So these were just under £20 for this whole set, which is quite a lot of money, but you can spend over £100 on just one watercolour paintbrush. So I thought that these were a kind of reasonable sort of set to use, and they've got a nice range of brush sort of tips to them as well. But you know, you don't have to use an expensive or costly paintbrush. Just use anything that you might already have, and you may also have one of those water brush pens that are quite handy, where you've got an area that you put water in and just squeeze out into the tip of a brush, and that's quite nice. You can put a lid on it then, and you can use that when you're out and about. But if you're working from home, then I'd say you might as well just use some paintbrushes. And I've also got obviously a little bit of water here. So all I'm going to do to begin with, because I can't resist it, is to put some water on these little areas of blue that I've done. So I'm just going to gently fade that out. And when I say fade that out, I think what I mean is I'm trying to lose the drawn marks underneath. And I'm just going to try and make it go a little bit paler around the edges, because what I quite like to achieve when I use watercolour is to lose in some instances anyway, the marks, the drawn marks that the pencils have actually made. And sometimes I find that's quite hard to achieve, because look there, you can still see them. But just with a little bit of water, you can get a nice fade out of colour. So even though this is watercolour paper, I think it is going to buckle a little bit, but it won't be as bad as if it wasn't watercolour paper. And then the other couple of materials I've got is a set of water-soluble wax pastels from Caran d'Ache, and that's some of those here. They're quite, I've again had these a very long time, so I can't remember how much these cost either, but that's quite a nice little tin, a good range of colours and very portable. And then I've got this other set, which I haven't used that much, but they are lovely, and they're from Derwent, and it's called Derwent Art Bar. And this is what they look like, which is very, very tempting. So I'll just get a few of these out and we'll compare them with the Caran d'Ache soluble oil pastel. So just like I did before, I'm just going to have a little play with this. This is the Caran d'Ache, and I'm putting it just still dry on the dry paper. It's quite sticky. And then an equivalent or colour from the Art Bar. I'm using the side of the pastel, whereas I could be making sort of stronger marks like that. Let's do the same up here as well. We'll see what results we get. I'll use a different brush this time to try and avoid polluting the colours too much. So this is the Caran d'Ache. That blends out really nicely. And there you can see that we're losing the actual marks of the dry on dry. I mean, in some instances you might want that. See, they're staying there a little bit and they're fading out now. And then this is the Derwent Art Bar. I'm pressing quite hard. Okay, and of course what I could do is add some more on that whilst it's still wet. Mix my colours. But what I'm going to do next is just have an experiment and show you some different ways that you can use your watercolour pencils and or pastels with water, which makes obvious sense, but there's a number of different combinations that you can use. So let's have a look at that. So what I'm going to do first is wet my paper. So I'm going to work into this wet paper with a dry pencil, and I'm going to use one of my Derwent watercolour ones. So dry pencil end on wet paper, and I'm going to write the word just so that we can remember. Dry on. Now that is quite satisfying. It does spread out really nicely. Dry on wet. And then I'm going to take another dry pencil. This is a slightly darker one. And this time I'm just going to put dry pencil onto dry paper, just to compare the results. So that is dry on dry. Okay, let's choose a different colour. I'll go for this Derwent orange. So this time I am going to write dry with a dry pencil on the dry paper, and then I'm going to put water on top. So that means that I'm going to be putting wet on dry. So that was dry on dry, and this is just at the moment it's dry on dry, but then I'm going to add some water. So that's where those marks still remain, which is quite nice. And we get a little bit of orange hue around the edge. And then finally, this is one of my favourites, I think. I get really rich colours. Wet paper. And a wet pencil. So I'm going to dip my pencil in the water and I'm going to write wet. So as I write, it's spreading out right on. I'm dipping again, wet on wet. So that's a nice little reminder of the different ways that you can use them and the sorts of the results that you might get. Right, I got myself a bit confused then, because I started off with putting the dry on the dry. So ignore that blob in the middle. We're going to be putting dry pencil onto wet paper. I'm just trying, pressing hard, pressing more softly. I could probably even smudge that with my finger. So that's dry onto wet. And then we know what dry on dry is going to look like, because I just did it there. That's dry on dry. Dry pencil and then wet paper, wetting the paper on top. And then let's do a blob of wet on wet. That's lovely and vibrant. Okay. So having just done that little exercise, now I'm going to get a new piece of paper and just have a play with combining all of those different sort of ideas, those different methods. So I'm actually just going to have a play on this piece of paper that I had a little practice on earlier. And I want to make use of the paper. So let's start off with some wet areas. I'm going to be quite quick with it, quite kind of broad brush with it to begin with. And I think I just want to kind of get some colour down. I'm not really going to be drawing anything specifically, anything realistic. I'm just going to be having a play. Let's use one of these wax pastels and see what happens there. So that's quite nice. So using watercolour pencils and or pastels, you can blend your colours to make different colours. So if I try a red, well, an orangey red, although I think this is called, it's called vermilion, an orangey red. Gonna make that a bit redder actually. That's rather nice. With a blue, I'm just wondering if I'm going to achieve a purple. Kind of a mauvey colour. That's a reddy purple because of the amount of red underneath. And pulling it out like that, it looks quite mauvey. There's my watercolour paper kind of balling up already. Let's make use of this wet area and go in with a pencil. And try one of the W.H. Smith's. And also some of this art bar. That's gone from wet to dry, which is quite nice. So depending on how much water you put on, obviously you'll get a different depth of colour, different kind of tone. What you might like to try is making a shape. Even though I said I wasn't going to do anything too realistic, I just wanted to show this where I think, so I'm using dry on dry here, and I think this would be quite nice if you wanted to do something a little bit more subtle and a little bit more carefully. So you might want to kind of draw the shape of whatever it is you're drawing before adding the colour, adding the water. And I'm just going to use one of the finer paintbrushes to do this now with water. So this is where we might be able to achieve something that does look a bit watercolory, because I think I'm going to be able to sort of blend out the pencil-y marks and make it look like it is just paint. And then I'll let that dry and I'll work on top of it. But of course you could also work on top of it wet, and you know what that might achieve as well. So whilst I'm letting that shape dry, I've made another one here which is still wet, and I'm just going to work into that with a dry pencil whilst it's still a bit wet, just to add a little bit of different shading. A slightly darker edge. And I'm probably going to blend this with some water as well, because I don't want these lines to be too harsh. They've remained quite harsh, so I'm just going to blend out with that original green again. Let's make some more pools of colour with the art bar. So I'm just going quite lightly, because I think that would then mean that hopefully will be able to just create a pool of colour and lose the markings that I've made with the pencil, with the pastel to begin with. I mean, that might be something you want to keep, is these marks underneath. But I found using watercolour pencils over the years that that's been an issue that I've sort of has prevented me from using them too much. I think for achieving really nice washes of colour, these are great. And I think I would use them for making backgrounds, probably, rather than sort of using entirely to kind of colour in something that I've drawn. So this is Art Bar, and this is Derwent pencil. Now I quite like that way it's kind of scratches in. So I think it is really worth just experimenting. I'm just going to go back to my little leaf shape, which is pretty much dry now, and work on top again with a dry pencil. So we're back to dry on dry. I just want to add a bit of variety to this leaf shape. I'll just put it down 1/2 and then go in with my water. So I think for me that I like using watercolour pencils and water soluble wax pastels, but I probably wouldn't use them just on their own to do an entire drawing or journal page, but I would definitely use them to add some colour, some areas of colour, either drawing and then adding the colour, or using them to create colour on a page and then drawing on top. So that might be one of the approaches that I take for next month's video. So whilst this is still wet, I'm going in with an orange, but with the green underneath it's looking a bit murky. But I quite like that definition that I can get on top of what I've just done. So this is dry on wet, whereas that was dry on dry and then adding water. This is dry on wet. And I sharpened all my pencils before I started, so I can get some nice definition actually. I don't think I'm going to put water on top of this. I don't want to lose that strong line of the orange on the green. So I think it might be worth making a little note as you go along as to how you've achieved certain things or certain results. What I've done here is I've just used my Derwent watercolour pencil just to make these 3 triangles, and some of the paper was still wet, some of it was less wet, so I just went with the flow with that. I've used a yellow pencil dry to work in there, but I want it to be a bit stronger. I want that yellow to be stronger, so I'm going to use my Art Bar yellow and roughly fill that purple shape in. And then that feels quite waxy. I'm going to go in with the water. I just wanted to brighten up this area of the page, even though it's totally random and just playing. I'll do the same with these. It's good fun. I want to make that stronger. So I'm going in on the, adding more to that wet surface. So I'm going to leave that as it is now. That was just really a play and trying all the different kind of methods of dry on wet, or dry on dry, wet on dry, and then wet on wet as well. So just to help me consolidate that, what I'm going to do now is a version of this, which I did earlier, and this is something you might like to do as just a reminder for how you can use your watercolour pencils and the different results you get. So this is one that I did before I started the video. So I've got dry on wet, and then that's just a little play of making a pattern, a random pattern with dry on wet. That's the same done, but dry on dry. That's the same done with wet on dry. So that's starting off with the pencils dry on the dry paper, but then putting water on top. And then this one, wet on wet, that is starting off with the paper wet and then using a wet pencil on top as well. So let's just do one of these. Let's finish with one of these and see how we get on. So I've made myself another little chart of like dry on wet, dry on dry, wet on dry, and wet on wet. And now what I'm going to do is just stick to each of these and have a play with making some different patterns. So dry on wet, so I need to wet the paper first. Let's do that. I've got some clean water. I can easily forget to do that, so let's start off with some nice fresh water and play with a dry pencil on wet paper and see what we can come up with. Right, I'll just leave that at that. So that is dry pencil on wet paper. And now let's do the same with just some dry pencils. Okay, I'll leave that at that. Then we've got wet on dry. So we start off with dry pencil on dry paper. Okay, let's go for it. So now this is wet on dry, so now I'm going to carefully, that's quite nice just leaving it like that actually, isn't it? With the dry in the middle, but I will go over it. just lightly. That's quite nice. It fades it all out a bit, blends it all a bit. The purple's bleeding slightly. And then let's finish with the wet pencil on wet paper. Oops, wet pencil, so I'm going to dip the pencil in the paper, in the water, I mean. So that is a very playful, experimental introduction to using watercolour pencils, and a few goes with some watercolour, some water-soluble wax pastels as well. So I will leave it at that for now. So I hope you enjoyed that little dabble into using watercolour pencils. Like I say, very much as kind of introduction and a starting point. So if you do have a set, or you decide that you're going to get a set, then enjoy having a play with them over the next month. And then in October, like I say, we will use them to make some drawings. So I will look forward to that. And in the meantime, enjoy using your watercolours or whatever it is that you're going to be doing over the next month for your art journaling, and let me know how you get on, because I always love to see what you're doing. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next month.